Ich fasse ein bisschen zusammen, was in letzter Zeit in der Slowakei passiert ist. Zum Teil, weil ich mich natürlich in Vorbereitung auf die Debatte mit Michael Porecki darauf sozusagen eingelesen hatte und vorbereitet hatte. Und das Produkt dieser Vorbereitung erzähle ich Ihnen jetzt, weil ich glaube, dass nicht alle, die hier sitzen, sich super in der Slowakei auskennen. Und es ist auch so schnell so viel passiert, dass es wichtig ist zu sehen, wie schnell man eine Demokratie in eine illiberale Demokratie umbauen kann und wie einfach das ist. Weil die rasende Geschwindigkeit, mit der Fico das in der Slowakei gemacht hat, übertrifft das, was Orbán in 14 Jahren geschafft hat, bei weitem. Und das ist ausgesprochen beunruhigend. Zweiter Punkt natürlich die Debatte über die bevorstehende, da kommt der Chef, die bevorstehende ÖVP-Regierung in Österreich, die diese ganze Fragestellung, die wir heute Abend diskutieren, nochmal sehr viel aktueller macht und die Frage auch aufwirft, ist das, was wir in der Slowakei gesehen haben und was wir in Ungarn gesehen haben, in den Niederlanden zurzeit vergegenwärtigen, ist das auch das Playbook für das, was Österreich bevorsteht. Also eine hochspannende Diskussion. Ein letzter Satz noch. Michael Porecki hat gestern mit hohem Fieber und Bronchitis trotzdem liebenswürdigerweise eine Art Brief geschickt, in dem er, nachdem ich ein wenig sozusagen einfach eher nachrichtlich zusammengefasst habe, was in letzter Zeit passiert ist, seit der Wahl von Fico, noch einmal seine persönlichen Eindrücke zusammenfasst. Ich muss dazu sagen, nur damit Sie das wissen, Porecki ist auch deshalb zurzeit so spannend, weil er von der slowakischen Kulturministerin wegen Verleumdung angezeigt wurde und letzte Woche sein erstes Polizeiverhör hatte und ihm drohen bis zu 5 Jahre Haft. Diese Slap-Klagen sind in der Slowakei inzwischen durchaus häufiger zu finden und auch das ist eine Bedrohung. Das war der eine Teil. Der zweite sitzt neben mir, nicht der Teil, sondern der Mann. Ferenc Laczó ist Assistenzprofessor für europäische Geschichte an der Universität Maastricht, lebt aber in Leiden. Und ist Autor und Herausgeber von 13 Büchern zu ungarischen, jüdischen, deutschen, europäischen und globalen Themen und hat zuletzt eine globale Geschichte Ungarns geschrieben, zusammen mit Balint Varga und Andras Vadas und ist Gastprofessor und Fellow am Harriman Institute der Columbia University, der Uni Basel und dem Mandel Center, where's the stress? Mandel Center for Advanced Holocaust Studies der United States Holocaust Memorial Museums. So. Er ist Spezialist für Ungarn, logischerweise, zweibändige Geschichte Ungarns, hat viele Bücher über Ungarn publiziert, ist aber als jemand, der in Holland lebt, natürlich auch jemand, der diese Entwicklung dort, den Wahlsieg von Wilders, die langen Koalitionsverhandlungen dort und zum Schluss die Entscheidung, Wilders nicht zum Regierungschef zu machen, sondern, das ist ja anders, als es hier zurzeit droht und auch anders als in der Slowakei war, Dick Schoof zum Premier zu machen, also einen Parteilosen, um zumindest das Kanzleramt nicht in die Hände von Geert Wilders zu geben. Auch darüber werden wir nachher noch sprechen, wie das möglich war. Und wenden uns aber erstmal der Slowakei zu, dann Ungarn und den Niederlanden und zum Schluss kommt dann noch Martin Milan Šimečky dazu und dann diskutieren wir sozusagen die Metaebene. Mehr als ein Jahr nach der Wahl, die war nämlich im Oktober 23 und dem 4. Amtsantritt von Robert Fico, zeichnet sich in der Slowakei ein deutlicher Trend zu einer illiberalen Demokratie ab. Mit seiner populistischen Agenda und einer prorussischen und zunehmend autoritären Regierungsführung treibt Fico eine umfassende Kontrolle der Institutionen voran. Vergleiche mit Ungarn und Polen und der PiS-Regierung der Abgewählten sind naheliegend. Nach diesen vorgezogenen Parlamentswahlen 23 wurde Fico, der Vorsitzende der Smer-Partei, ist eine linkspopulistische Partei, zum 4. Mal, wie gesagt, Premierminister. Seine Regierungskoalition besteht aus der Smer, der LAS, das heißt also auf Slowakisch Volos, also die Stimme, Partei des amtierenden Präsidenten Peter Pellegrini, auch ein Fahrensmann von Fico, und der SNS, der slowakischen Nationalpartei, die rechtspopulistische bis rechtsextreme Positionen vertritt. Seit seiner Rückkehr zeichnet sich die slowakische Politik durch eine polarisierende Entwicklung aus, die bei vielen Beobachtern Assoziationen zu den Wegen von Ungarn und Polen erweckt, aber in der Geschwindigkeit und der Radikalität beispiellos ist. Ich will Ihnen dafür einige Beispiele nennen. Zum einen geht es um die Machtübernahme und die Kontrolle des Staatsapparates. Seit 1923 hat Fico diesen slowakischen Staatsapparat extrem konsequent umgestaltet. Am ersten Tag nach der Vereidigung wurde die Polizeiführung ausgetauscht. Es folgte eine Strafrechtsreform, die unter anderem die Auflösung der Sonderstaatsanwalt für Korruptionsfälle und eine Senkung der Strafen für Korruptionsdelikte beinhaltete. Ein Vorwurf, dem sich Fico ständig stellen muss, ist, dass er selber sehr korrupt ist. Die Abschaffung dieser Sonderstaatsanwaltschaft, bei der die EU nochmal intervenierte, einige Abschwächungen im Gesetz erreichte, letztlich aber die Abschaffung trotzdem nicht verhindern konnte, kommt also auch ihm persönlich zugute. Das Verfassungsgericht hat diese Reformen bestätigt und diese Sonderstaatsanwaltschaft existiert inzwischen gar nicht mehr. Dann wurde das Nationale Kriminalamt aufgelöst, das vorher diese Korruptionsfälle untersucht hat, in die viele prominente Smer-Mitglieder verwickelt waren. Stattdessen wurde eine neue Einheit zur Bekämpfung der organisierten Kriminalität geschaffen, die aber der Smer untersteht. Der Geheimdienst geriet ebenfalls unter Ficos Kontrolle. Ein politisch mit der Smer eng vernetzter Leiter, der Sohn eines Abgeordneten von der Smer, wurde ernannt, ohne Zustimmung der damaligen Präsidentin Čaputová, die inzwischen nicht mehr Präsidentin ist. Also da wurde ganz klar nach politischen Loyalitäten besetzt. In puncto Medien- und Meinungsfreiheit ging die Sache mindestens genauso schnell, wenn nicht schneller. Ein Beispiel ist der private Sender Markisa, der unter Druck gesetzt wurde massiv und dessen politische Berichterstattung weitgehend neutralisiert wurde. Moderatoren wurden ausgetauscht, Talkshows quasi abgeschafft. Die Zusammenarbeit mit liberalen, kritischen Moderatoren wurde komplett beendet. Der staatliche Rundfunk, Sie werden das alle gelesen haben, wurde neu strukturiert. Er wurde in seiner bisherigen Form abgeschafft und durch den neuen Sender Slowakisches Fernsehen und Radio ersetzt, der überwiegend regierungsfreundliche und neutrale Inhalte sendet. Fico hat dort quasi eine Art Dauersendung wie Orban in Ungarn auch. Die Berichterstattung der Medien im Sinne der Regierung zu kontrollieren und zu beeinflussen, ist weitgehend gelungen. Die Zivilgesellschaft, die NGOs werden ebenfalls eingeschüchtert. Es wird seit langem über ein sogenanntes Agentengesetz diskutiert, wie wir es aus Russland und Ungarn mittlerweile kennen oder aus Georgien. Soweit ich weiß, Herr Šimečka weiß es wahrscheinlich besser, ist das noch nicht beschlossen. Aber es ist zumindest in Arbeit. Die liberale Partei hat die Europawahlen gewonnen, ist ein starker Gegenpol. Es gibt permanent Demonstrationen, Proteste, die bisher aber relativ wenig bewirkt haben. Die Wahl von Pellegrini zum Präsidenten hat sozusagen diesen Counterpart noch einmal leider nivelliert, weil die PS, die liberale Partei, zwar als Oppositionspartei sehr viril ist, aber keinen Einfluss auf diesen Staatsumbau hat, keinen aktiven. Die Veränderung des Wahlgesetzes steht im Raum. Auch das ist etwas, was ein Modell von Orban ist. Fico möchte die Zahl der Parteien im Parlament reduzieren und möchte die Hürde für den Eintritt ins Parlament von 5 auf 7% erhöhen und die Erhöhung der Kaution, die man hinterlegen muss, wenn man kandidieren will, ebenfalls stark erhöhen, sodass kleinere Parteien oder ärmere Kandidaten gar nicht mehr die Chance haben, sich zu bewerben. Kabinett und Kultur. Ein ganz wichtiges Thema, das Thema, über das wir, glaube ich, am meisten gelesen haben, was die Slowakei angeht. Umweltminister wurde Tomáš Taraba aus dem völkischen Umfeld mit Wurzeln in der Neonazi-Szene. Kultusministerin, die besagte Martina Šimkovičová. Richtig? Šimkovičová. Sie ist eine ehemalige TV-Moderatorin und wurde von ihrem früheren Arbeitgeber, einem Privatsender, wegen rassistischer Kommentare während der Flüchtlingskrise 2015 entlassen. Sie war eine Art rechte Influencerin, die quasi über die Wahlliste in die Regierung und ins Ministeramt gekommen ist, kein Parteimitglied. Sie ist anti-woke, anti-queer, hält die Bedrohung der weißen Rasse für das wesentliche Thema in der aktuellen Zeit, glaubt an Chemtrails, verbreitet Fake News. Ihr Generalsekretär ist ein Flat Earther und glaubt an die Islamisierung Europas durch Illuminaten. So ist das Kultusministerium zurzeit besetzt. Sie hat, ich mache das nur kurz, die Direktorinnen des Kinderkulturzentrums, der Nationalbibliothek, des Nationaltheaters, der Nationalgalerie, des Nationalmuseums und des Denkmalamtes entlassen. Die Kunsthalle Bratislava wurde gleich ganz aufgelöst. 40% der Mitarbeiter im Kultusministerium wurden gefeuert. Sie hat, wie gesagt, Worecki wegen Verleumdung angezeigt und nicht nur ihn, sondern auch einige andere Kollegen, zum Beispiel Peter Bardi, den Chefredakteur von einem wichtigen Nachrichtenportal. Die außenpolitische Ausrichtung haben wir auch in den letzten Tagen relativ viel darüber gehört, vor allem aus Anlass des Stopps der Gaslieferungen der russischen durch die Ukraine, der Besuch von Fico bei Putin, der natürlich auch schon eine Provokation war, die Drohung gegen die Ukraine, keine Stromlieferungen mehr, quasi als Rache für die ausbleibenden Gaslieferungen zu starten, um die Ukraine, deren Infrastruktur durch russische Bomben zerstört ist, nicht mehr zu unterstützen. Er hat auch angekündigt, er werde am 9. Mai nach Moskau fliegen und den Friedensschluss oder den Frieden, den die russische Armee erzwungen hat, dort mit Herrn Putin zu feiern. Das Fazit meiner kurzen, sozusagen eher nachrichtlichen Zusammenfassung kann kein anderes sein, als dass sich Fico als autoritärer Anführer geriert, dessen Hauptziel die Machtkonsolidierung ist, nach 30 Jahren, in der er zum 4. Mal Premier ist, die Regierung Šimečka überlebt hat, den Rücktritt nach der Ermordung von Jan Kuciak überlebt hat. Das ist ein wichtiger Name, den man auch noch nennen muss. Jener sehr legendäre investigative Journalist, der 2017, 18 im Umfeld von Fico und anderen Smear-Mitgliedern wegen Korruption ermittelt hat, ermordet wurde. Es gab ein Verfahren gegen einen Oligarchen, dem die Verantwortung für diese Ermordung, also der Mordauftrag, der deswegen angeklagt wurde. Er ist letztlich ungeschoren davongekommen. Bis heute ist dieser Fall nicht aufgeklärt. Fico musste damals wegen der Proteste zurücktreten. Auch das ist, glaube ich, ein Thema für ihn, genauso wie für Trump, dieses Gefühl, sozusagen von der Justiz gejagt worden zu sein, Rache nehmen zu wollen, sicher ein wichtiger Topos. Umfassende Kontrolle über Medien, Justiz, öffentliche Institutionen zeigen allesamt, dass die Slowakei auf dem Weg zu einer illiberalen Demokratie ist, und die Frage ist, wie das noch aufzuhalten ist. Jetzt ein Text von Michal Borecki, der liebe Grüße schickt, da ist er, den er gestern Nacht im Bett geschrieben hat, aber man merkt ihm das hohe Fieber nicht an. Liebes Publikum, leider hat mich eine schlimme Grippe erwischt und ich kann heute Abend nicht bei Ihnen sein, so wie ich mir das gewünscht hätte. Ich schreibe aus Bratislava, wo mich gestern eine weitere Nachricht über die Säuberung im slowakischen Kulturbetrieb erreicht hat. Der erfahrene Direktor des slowakischen Literaturzentrums wurde gestern ebenfalls entlassen, ohne Begründung. In Wien kennt man seit Jahren diese Institution, zum Beispiel vom Stand bei der Messe Buch Wien und von spannenden Veranstaltungen bei der Donau Lounge. Seit letztem Jahr gibt es in meiner Heimat eine Welle von Entlassungen in vielen wichtigen kulturellen Institutionen wie Nationalgalerie, Nationaltheater, Nationalmuseum, die alle direkt dem Kulturministerium unterstellt sind. Das betrifft insgesamt 30 Institutionen. Vielleicht nur bei 4 von ihnen arbeitet heute noch die frühere Führung. Kultusministerin Martina Šimkovičová hat vom ersten Tag im Amt an klargemacht, dass es nur eine rein slowakische Kultur geben soll und keine andere. Sie hat auch viele wirtschaftliche Schritte unternommen, um die öffentlichen Fördergelder für die Minderheiten und Andersdenkenden einzuschränken. Es wurde von ihr auch sofort der neue Direktor des slowakischen Kulturzentrums und Literaturzentrums vorgeschlagen, ein bekannter Verschwörungstheoretiker, prorussischer Propagandist, ein Impfgegner. 4-mals wurde bewiesen, dass er in seinen zahlreichen Büchern plagiiert hat, Dutzende Seiten abgeschrieben hat, geklaut hat. Doch sein Profil passt perfekt zum rechtsradikalen Weltbild der Kultusministerin, die er lautstark und treu unterstützt. Auch sie vertritt ultranationalistische Einstellungen und verbreitet Verschwörungsmythen wie den großen Austausch. Dieses Narrativ will Anknüpfungspunkte zur Mitte unserer Gesellschaft bieten. Genauso wollen rechtsextreme Akteure über das eigene Milieu hinauswirken. Šimkovičová sagte im August 24, das Aussterben der weißen Rasse sei durch LGBTQ-Personen verursacht. Der Generalsekretär des Ministeriums, Lukas Machala, ich hatte ihn auch schon erwähnt, glaubt, die Illuminaten nutzen den Islam, um unsere Zivilisation zu zerstören. Diese Wahrheit soll seiner Ansicht nach Putin herausgefunden haben und die Amerikaner hätten den Kiewer Maidan angezettelt und in der Ukraine eine zionistische Marionettenregierung installiert. Er bezweifelt, dass die Erde rund ist und warnte neulich auf seinem Telegram-Kanal vor einer außerirdischen Invasion. Das ist, ich sage es Ihnen, leider kein Witz. Schon in der Nacht haben die Kollegen aus der Literatur einen öffentlichen Aufruf geschrieben, den ich ergänzt und unterzeichnet habe. Die Kultur ist zu einem wichtigen gesellschaftlichen Thema in der Slowakei geworden. Der Warnstreik dauert an und bedeutet, dass es nach fast jeder Theatervorstellung, Lesung oder Vernissage kurze Ansprachen gibt, die das Publikum über die Ereignisse im Kulturleben kritisch informiert. Nur 12 Stunden brauchte auch kurz vor und nach Weihnachten die Initiative Mir Ukraine, der Frieden in der Ukraine, um Demonstrationen zu organisieren. 5000 Menschen versammelten sich am Platz der Freiheit in Bratislava, um gegen die prorussische Politik des slowakischen Ministerpräsidenten zu protestieren. Auf einem Schild stand einfach, es riecht nach Verrat. Die Demonstrationen begannen nach Ficos überraschendem Besuch bei Putin in Moskau, nur wenige Tage, nachdem die Ukraine den Gastransit von Russland über ihr Gebiet gestoppt hatte. Fico kritisiert wiederholt Kiew scharf für die Einstellung und drohte, die Energieversorgung der Ukraine zu unterbrechen und die Hilfe für Menschen auf der Flucht einzustellen. Als Russland 2022 seine groß angelegte Invasion der Ukraine startete, wurde das Nachbarland Slowakei zu einem der entschiedensten Unterstützer der Ukraine. Unter der Führung des ehemaligen Verteidigungsministers war die Slowakei auch das erste Land, das der Ukraine Kampfflugzeuge zur Verfügung stellte. Es übergab seine MiG-29 an die stark dezimierte ukrainische Luftwaffe zusammen mit den S-300 Luftverteidigungssystemen. Im September 2023 vollzog die vierte Regierung von Fico jedoch eine 180-Grad-Wende. Mit einer Rhetorik, die den Westen offen für den Krieg Russlands verantwortlich machte und schwor, Kiew niemals militärische Hilfe zu leisten, schlug die Slowakei einen Weg ein, der dem unseres Nachbarn Ungarn sehr ähnlich ist. Ich war bei den beiden Demos gegen Ficos kremlfreundliche Haltung dabei, um zu protestieren. Wir schwenkten die Flaggen der Europäischen Union und riefen, wir sind nicht Russland, wir sind Europa. Dann hörten wir unsere Hymne, die Ode an die Freude. Wir betreten feuertrunken, himmlische, dein Heiligtum. Der slowakische visuelle Künstler Rudolf Sikora, einer der Hauptredner bei der Protestveranstaltung, rief die slowakischen Oppositionsparteien dazu auf, sich mit Aktivisten und Bürgerverbänden gegen die Bedrohung durch den russischen Einfluss und gegen den Hybridkrieg zu verbünden. Ich bitte Sie, Oppositionspolitiker, kommen Sie vernünftig zusammen, rief er. Er ist 80 und eine Legende der slowakischen Kultur und des Widerstandes. Über 100 Mal wurde er in den 70er und 80er Jahren als Dissident verhört. Aktiv bereitete er die Samtene Revolution 89 vor. Sein Aufruf auf die Oppositionsparteien gilt auch für Österreich. 3 Monate lang wurde in Wien eine Dreierkoalition intensiv vorbereitet. Aber die endlosen Streitereien, die Unfähigkeit zum Kompromiss, die mangelnde Bereitschaft von eigenen Positionen abzurücken und sich für die Republik zu entscheiden, all das führte dazu, dass am Ende doch keine proeuropäische demokratische Regierung gebildet wird, obwohl sie im Zeitalter multipler Krisen äußerst nützlich gewesen wäre. Und anstatt konstruktiv zu handeln, geben sich jetzt alle Partner gegenseitig die Schuld für ihr gemeinsames Scheitern. Das Chaos und die Streitereien haben dazu geführt, dass die radikale FPÖ bei der Wahl 28,8% der Stimmen erhielt, heute in Umfragen aber schon fast bei 40% steht und sich nun mit einer sehr langen Geschichte kolossaler Korruptionsskandale als Garant der Stabilität stilisiert. In Österreich wurde letztes Jahr viel über die Slowakei geschrieben, weil wir als warnendes Beispiel für die Katastrophe herangezogen wurden, in die eine Koalition mit den Rechtsextremen das Land führen würde. Das war leider nicht genug. Selbst in einem viel reicheren und besser funktionierenden Land wie Österreich wählen immer mehr Menschen eine rechtsextreme, kremlfreundliche Partei. Die Slowakei warnt, was es bedeuten kann, wenn man mit diesen Politikern koaliert. Sie werden nicht plötzlich milder oder versuchen, tatsächlich Probleme zu lösen. Viele in Österreich sagen jetzt, lass die FPÖ doch regieren, damit die Leute sehen, dass sie es nicht können. Ich sage, lieber bitte nicht. Vor einem Vierteljahrhundert reagierte Europa auf die ähnlich skandalöse österreichische Koalition mit Empörung und Boykott. Heute ist alles anders. Die Tendenz zur Autokratie wurde zu einem globalen Problem. Mit den Neofaschisten zu regieren, ist im digitalen Zeitalter kein Tabu mehr. Die Entstehung einer 5. Kolonne Russlands droht direkt in der Mitte des Kontinents. Die Partnerschaft zwischen Russland, Ungarn, Österreich und Tschechien, der kleptokratischen Autokraten, ähnelt auf der Landkarte der alten Donaumonarchie. Oder erinnert sie eher eine Brosche fröhlicher Apokalypse? Wird die liberale Demokratie in unserer Region das 21. Jahrhundert überleben? Immer deutlicher zeigt sich ein neues Bündnis zwischen den globalen Tech-Oligarchen und den neuen rechten Regierungen ab. Österreich ist klein, aber die Welt hat dort viele politische Experimente erlebt, die später im großen Stil anderswo fortgesetzt wurden. Na, servus. So, das mit Grüßen aus Bratislava von Michal Porecki. Und jetzt lasse ich das so stehen. Und gebe übergangslos weiter an Ferenc, der Englisch spricht. Wir werden nachher einen Mix machen, aber ich glaube, das ist für niemanden ein Problem, hoffentlich.
Good evening, and thank you so much for the invitation and the opportunity to contribute. And I'm also really sorry that Michal Porecki cannot be here tonight, and we had to improvise a bit when it comes to the details of this panel, but I wanted to speak as originally planned about the Netherlands in the first place, reflect on the situation in the higher education sector in particular, and I try to show you why this is in fact a really significant European issue. I hope I'll convince you by the end of this brief talk. And then I also want to offer some comparative reflections on the Netherlands and Hungary, which happen to be two countries that I know somewhat well. And I have lived in both for more than a decade. Now let me start with something very basic. You will probably know that the Netherlands is of course often called a relatively small country. It's also the single most densely populated one in Europe. It has some 18 million people, and it's in fact the fifth largest economy of the European Union. Its economy is roughly twice as large as that of Austria and roughly half as large as that of Italy, right? So we're talking about quite a significant player. It is, of course, part of the Benelux, right? Surrounded by the UK, France, and Germany. And that is very important to emphasize in the context of European integration, because what European integration, in a sense, brings to the Dutch is, well, becoming very closely intertwined with Germany in particular, in a country which, in terms of its orientation in the world, feels itself often closer to the Anglo-Saxon countries, to use a somewhat anachronistic expression, and also to the Scandinavian ones. You know, if you look at the monograph of the late Dutch historian Matthias Seeger's Reis naar het continent, The Journey to the Continent, he basically asks a really puzzling question. Why did the Dutch actually engage in the main form of European integration from the very beginning, you know, go along, obviously with the Maastricht Treaty, with the Euro and so on, when the countries they felt closest to, such as the UK or Denmark, actually didn't do that, opted out or, you know, joined later or, well, in the case of Britain, obviously left more recently. So that is, of course, quite a peculiar situation, right? What you have here, and really in need of explanation. And I think one way to think about it would be to say that there's a very strong tradition of liberal internationalism in the Netherlands. I think that's really a key term here, right? The Dutch tend to strongly believe in something like market integration, combined with a system of kind of international rules. That is also to say that they're often quite skeptical towards what they see as kind of the French statist tradition, and also they are quite skeptical towards visions of a kind of common Europe or a kind of federal project, you know, discourses around which are certainly much more popular, I would say, in Germany and in a host of other countries. You know, we could go into that. But then they do something really quite unusual, which is that they open and internationalize the higher education system more than any of these other countries I have just mentioned, right? If you look at Dutch higher education these days, most of the master programs are in English. Half of the bachelor education is also in English. Half of the faculty that are employed, well, including, of course, myself at Dutch universities, happens to come from abroad. Many of these people have never studied in the Netherlands. Well, they may never have worked in Dutch or may not know the Dutch language. So it's quite an interesting situation. And, you know, the Dutch didn't really do this because they were such committed Europeans, as I tried to indicate just before. I think they did it in quite a pragmatic spirit, right? There was a sense that universities are getting their funding through student enrollment numbers, and, you know, well, expanding for a program, you know, would have to you know, find some kind of obvious way. And in the context of the Bologna process and in the process of European integration, well, attracting students from abroad was the obvious solution to that kind of goal, right? Some nowadays say that the Dutch, in a way, Europeanized in a fit of absent-mindedness, right? That's sort of partly, of course, a joke, but it's, I think, quite telling. But this, of course, is also something that made them actually immensely successful, I should say. If you look at very basic indicators, right? Let's take, you know, European Research Council grants. The Netherlands is the single most overrepresented country in the whole of the EU. They win disproportionately, much more so than any other country. You know, I often like to say, you know, if Germany has become an export Weltmeister also in terms of exporting some of its best academicians, well, the Netherlands has imported a lot of them, and not only from Germany. Of course, this ERC a story you probably know is of course a source of a huge controversy because of all the imbalances in the system, but we don't need to go into that now. So what is happening politically? Let me get to my second major point. Many of you may know that the Netherlands had a right-leaning liberal rule between 2010 and 2024, right? Characterizes the Mark Rutte era, right? A bit like the Merkel epoch in German history, right? The longest serving prime minister in Dutch history, who was, of course, the leader of the VVD, a right-leaning liberal party, the first liberal prime minister in nearly a century, right? He's currently, of course, the Secretary General of NATO, so he's still in a very, very high position. And he led 4 coalitions in a row. He started out, and it's important to keep in mind, he started out with a government which was a minority government supported by the PVV, by Wilders' party. And in fact, that first coalition government of his fell in 2012 because Wilders decided not to support it anymore. Then he had a grand coalition with the left. And then he had 2 four-party coalition governments, right? Those were the third and the fourth Rutte governments. And that is, of course, also to say that there has been a very significant fragmentation in the Netherlands. You know, if you look at the parliament today, which I think is really extraordinary, you have 150 seats, and you have 15 parties that are represented there. And in fact, 2 parties ran on a joint list, so you could say there are 16 parties in parliament. You also have a Senate with 75 members, and there also you have 15, there's a separate election, right? You also have 15 parties there, right? So this is very, very fragmented landscape. I often say, you know, for historians, what is really fascinating is how countries can become exaggerated versions of themselves in certain moments, right? When I think of Macron, I tend to think of, you know, he's a bit of a caricature of a monarchist tradition that the French presidents tend to represent, you know, excuse for the subjective opinion. You know, Hungary, of course, has this strong idea of national resistance, and they exaggerate it beyond all measure these days. And there is something like that in the Dutch political culture as well. And it's in a way very difficult to say whether we're still living in something like a consensual democracy, right? Democracy based on negotiation, you know, large agreements, you know, somehow trying to include all important voices and all that, or a very polarized one. Actually, it's kind of an open question. But one thing which is for sure is that there was a major electoral shock last year, right? In late 2023, the PVV got 23.5% of the votes. And both the VVD and the leftist coalition of the Green Left and the Labour Party, they got below 16%. Right now, of course, if you look at the fourth biggest party, which is the Omzicht's New Social Contract, the kind of post-Christian Democratic Party, you can still say that you have the whole spectrum, right? You have right-wing populists, you have right-wing liberals, you have the left, and you have this kind of post-Christian democratic new party. And of course, 23.5%, I'm sad to say, of course, but it's not very extreme in a European context. If you look at quite a number of countries, far-right parties get roughly that much. But Wilders got nearly 2.5 million votes, and he never got more than 1.5 million before, right? So it's a massive, massive increase. And also massive rightward shift, right? There's been a lot of studies on, you know, where the people came from, and it's very clear that the main trend is, of course, from the center-right to the far right. So from the VVD, also from the former, like the CDA, that's the Christian Democratic Party in the Netherlands, their voters shifted to the far right in huge numbers. In this sense, I would say it's a bit like Italy or France, for that matter, where, you know, the center-right has declined to such an extent that, in fact, the far right is the main force on the right. Now, of course, it looked like, and this is again something you may remember if you were, you know, following the news, that it looked like there would be no coalition possibility. First of all, because the VVD said after 14 years in power that they wouldn't join as a junior partner in a new coalition, especially led by the far right. And then once they, you know, they removed their 15% or so, there was no real possibility of any coalition being formed in this very fragmented system, right? You could really add up the numbers and nothing really worked. And of course, there was a very strong sense that Wilders shouldn't be allowed to become prime minister, that he's too radical as a kind of anti-immigrant politician, that he even propagated an exit, right, a Dutch exit from the EU, which is a kind of a crazy idea, I think, and also banning of the Quran. which is something he called for several times in the past, right? So that he should not be allowed. And what came out of all this kind of mess, if you wish, is an extra parliamentary government, as it was mentioned already before, led by Dick Schoof, who's a former civil servant and also former spy chief. I think that's important to add. He was basically brought in to lead the most right-wing government in Dutch history, as it was labeled immediately. And there's, of course, nowadays also quite, after something like half a year of their activities, quite a bit of a debate, which I won't go into too much, whether this is really an extra parliamentary government, right? They seem to be pretending to be kind of independent of the parties. There was, first a coalition agreement between the four parties, and then they had a government agreement which was much more detailed by this independent sounding government. But of course we see, practically based on a whole host of cases, that those parties are in a way running the show, as probably you would expect, right? So this term of an extra parliamentary government is in a way a fiction, or at least it seems to be revealed as a fiction. And again, there's a debate about that, so I don't mean to take a too strong stance. But what was the main agenda of this government? Well, I think until now we see two things. One is a major expenditure, major extra expenditure on the military, right? Which, we can discuss and debate what that means today, and then a major cut in education, right? They announced very quickly that they would cut 2 billion euros from educational funding. And that would, of course, mean the firing of thousands of people. It's a kind of combination of austerity policies with a de-internationalization, and I want to say more about that in a second. And this led to quite large protests, quite unusual in the Netherlands, right? People don't quite like to go to the streets in large numbers, but there were quite some significant protests organized in favor of higher education. And now we're at a moment where the budget cut seems to have become 1.25 billion, which is still, of course, a hell of a lot, I would say, but it's certainly somewhat less than was originally announced. So we're moving, in a sense, from a kind of right-wing liberal rule, which was also interested in internationalization, to a kind of new form of austerity, which is also combined with de-internationalization. And I'll give you one example, which I think is very telling and also may help you understand what's happening, I think. This expansion which we have experienced in the educational system through internationalization went hand in hand with relative underfunding. I'll give you my favorite example, if I can call it favorite. I also personally have a 60% teaching contract, which obviously means that I should have 40% research time. But I was told by colleagues that what they now call a 60% teaching load used to be called a 100% teaching load 20 years ago, right? So you there immediately see what is happening in a sense. And the interesting thing is that, of course, this created a possibility for the right-wing populists to blame internationalization for the worsening conditions and for what they call the declining quality of higher education. There's a very strong discourse around that, right? That it's become kind of too diverse in a sense and so on. But I think you have to realize that quite a number of issues come together here. The first is, of course, the question of internationalization that I already mentioned. The second is, and there's really a lot of debate there, and I think a very interesting one about the dominance of English, right? And of course, I'm guilty of this crime of speaking English right here, but there is really a serious problem. And I can maybe illustrate that quickly with my own university, right? We have more German students than Dutch. All our programs at my faculty are in English. Maastricht is, of course, something like 25-30 kilometers away from the German border, Aachen and what have you. In the south, we have the French-speaking parts of Belgium, Wallonia, again, within 25 kilometers and even less. Probably if you come to the level of smaller towns, Liège is 25 away. So, of course, you could say that if you teach about Europe, you do European studies, why to use English exclusively, right? I think that's a legitimate point for debate, by the way. But in any case, but the interesting thing is, Dutch students come to study with us. If we ask them, why they choose our university, they say because it's in English. We want to study in English, right? So there is really quite an interesting, I think, discrepancy there. Now, there's a second layer, which is the anti-elitism. Again, quite popular. The idea, international academia, I think you know it from quite a number of countries in very similar ways, is kind of a disembodied structure. It's not kind of part of Dutch society. These are kind of elites that are sort of on top of us and know better and so on. And we don't like that. There is a kind of strong culture of anti-elitism in the Netherlands. I happen to encounter it fairly frequently. There's certainly a populist logic in the sense anything too theoretical, too abstract is somehow suspect. And then again you see that practically everywhere politicization, right? The idea academia is left-leaning, is woke in quotation marks, and that's kind of, so there is this package, right? And this is kind of very hard to sort of disentangle, which is the so to say the cause and which are sort of part of the explanation that you then have to bring in, like whether it's the anti-international turn, whether it's the anti-woke mobilization, or so. These are all basically, or anti-elitism as such. These are all really closely interconnected in the discourse and in the way they want to reform the system. And here I would like to, again, make it very clear that I don't think that the threat that we're facing is about the budget cuts as such, right? This is very much in the news. It's the source of all the demonstrations in recent months. But the de-internationalization is actually the one that would, I think, radically change the system. And that, I think, is really indeed a major European concern, or should be one, because of all the things that I mentioned earlier, right? That the Dutch Europeanized actually more than anybody else in this respect, I would say. Right? There's also an interesting side note I wanted to make, and I'll come to a close very soon, which is that now what is being debated in politics is how to assure exceptions, right? The Dutch actually don't like, which is, I think in many countries you would have a law and then it would be enforced across the board. That's not really the Dutch style. There's always a kind of element of pragmatism, I would say. And here, the interesting thing is that border regions, or what they call disadvantaged or shrinking regions, to translate it directly from Dutch, they would maybe get an exception. And Maastricht, of course, well, there is a clear example, which would create an extremely interesting new situation, right? A lot of people came to study to the Netherlands after Brexit because of the English language education. And now it may be the peripheries of the country that will remain international, whereas the center would become, Dutch again, so to say, right? So that is again, I think, a fascinating example of something about European integration, right? Nation states and market logic, and then certain outcomes which create sometimes a much more international periphery than what you may have in the center. Because if you think about the introduction of English in higher education, you can really see, I think, a very interesting shift in the perspective, because originally the idea was we offer all these English language programs to our students here in the Netherlands so they can make international careers, right? It will be better for our Dutch kids to do this, and we do it on the cheap, right? It's kind of at home, so and then they go and do great things internationally because the world is moving in that direction and so on, right? Now, and I think Yannis will probably appreciate this based on his own research, there is this sense that the Dutch taxpayer is paying for the middle-class kids from Eastern Europe. Right? There's a very strong discourse precisely about that. I think Yannis won't be too surprised to hear this, right? So it's much more difficult to sell this if you have that kind of framing in a society which doesn't consist of committed Europeans, right, where they kind of internationalized in a pragmatic spirit. All right, last part, very quickly. I hope I haven't run out of time yet. I just wanted to say three quick things about the comparison, because I was also very much asked to try to bring in the Hungarian perspective, which I didn't want to focus on, as you could hear. But I wanted to make three quick points here. The first is that, of course I've been following, the politics and the culture of both countries for quite a while in a certain way. And I must say, when I was younger, 10 or 20 years ago, I used to think that the nationalists or the right-wing populists in the two countries are very different. I often said, if you look at liberalism, right, the question of liberalism, well, the Dutch far right was actually quite liberal in the sense that they always said we're pro-Western, we're pro-gender equality, unlike those others, of course, and so on. We want to respect, LGBT rights, and so. So this was a kind of, gender-based or also sometimes, sexuality-based nationalism that was very often, of course, directed towards Muslims in particular. And of course, you see this in Geert Wilders, I think, almost immediately. Whereas, of course, in Hungary, well, the right-wing populists were illiberal and proudly so often anti-Western, and you know the story, right? So I thought that was very different, but I'm not so sure anymore. Right now, the thing has become in a sense, so transnationalized. The discourses are so similar that you often hear them more or less arguing in exactly the same terms. Now, I should also say, when I look at this rightist turn in the Netherlands that we are experiencing at the moment, also in the light of the trajectory of Hungary, right, which again has been going through something like this for a decade and a half or so, I don't really see that kind of methodical attempt at centralizing power, right? I don't think there's a kind of methodical, kind of shrewd attempt to do that. That's not quite what it looks like to me. But having said that, I also see that there are really serious new problems in terms of the rule of law, in terms of democratic backsliding. And of course, I happen to be a graduate of CU Budapest, and therefore I see this kind of nationalistically motivated attack on higher education as actually very, very similar, and we may want to discuss that further.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Before I ask our other guests to join us, I have a few questions, because, to be honest, I don't know very much about the Netherlands. Okay, join us, come on. That's fine. You'll have to listen another 5 minutes. If that's fine with you, you can join us. That's perfectly fine. I have a few questions in addition to what you said before we open up the whole discussion. When you mentioned that internationalization and the cuts, trying to diminish it, was that part of the electoral campaign of Wilders saying we are too international, we're too English, we're too, we have too many foreigners, or is that just a product of debates within the government?
That's a very interesting question. So basically this turn against internationalization started with the previous government when we had a left liberal Minister of Education who was at, I believe, Princeton Center for Advanced Studies for a long time. And he came back to the Netherlands, and when you wake up after 20 years or something like that, you suddenly get shocked. And he was very surprised at how little Dutch was being taught at the universities. And he sort of made it part of his kind of mission to say, and there was already, of course, a very popular mobilization around it, including, of course, among academics, right? I mean, and that is, of course, something I sympathize with on some level. Many people say, well, why do we always have to teach English, right? In English, right? So there is that element, and so that's how it started in a way. Ironically enough, it was a D66 or left liberal member of the previous coalition that brought this up, and of course now it's basically being introduced also into law. Maybe I should say, for me personally, the most interesting thing is that I have to pass language exams. And there was a very kind of funny moment at our department when my head of department said, I realize that some of you may speak Dutch really well here, but you may not yet have that certificate to prove it. And then one of my Dutch colleagues spoke up. Well, I think that goes for a lot of us, And well, basically we are now obliged to prove that we know it well enough and that's already being something being implemented as we speak.
Okay, I have another question. Maybe that's a cliche, but I remember Wilders in his first years as being mainly anti-Islamist, anti-Muslim, anti-everything that has to do with foreign cultures, more general than, English question, internationalization, and anti-elitist. Has that been prevalent in the last years, or why did he win so many more votes? What were his main campaign promises? Because I really didn't understand that so far.
Look, so my sense is that Wilders hasn't really changed. I think the society has changed, to be quite honest. He's you may know he's the only member of his party. He's a person who's also been himself quite under threat for some of the very radical things he said. For me personally, the most interesting thing about him is probably his family background in a sense, right? He's also happens to be married, by the way, to somebody from Hungary, but that's a detail. But his family has very strong connections to Indonesia and to the War of Independence. As you may know, this connection, right? That this anti-Islam sentiment is probably, even though I haven't read very thorough research about it yet, but it's probably connected to the War of Independence of Indonesia, where his family was not on the side of the Indonesian independence movement, but on the Dutch side, as you can probably imagine. So I think that what has really happened is basically a breakthrough of an argument that the establishment is failing us. Right? Okay. That this idea that especially with the COVID and with the kind of rising inequality in the country and, you know, with life becoming much more difficult in terms of, you know, rent, in terms of, you know, prices in the supermarket and things like that, you want to basically show to the political establishment that you will no longer tolerate this. And this is I would say, a large percent of what he gained extra, which is like another 10% or more. Yeah.
Okay. Two more questions. I don't want to be impolite, but I think we need some groundwork to do before we can start the discussion, because I don't know how many of you know a lot about Netherlands. Maybe we have to add some. You did not mention at all the Russia question, Ukraine question, war question. Is that a big debate in the Netherlands, or is that something that hasn't been questioned, the support for Ukraine, for example?
It has definitely been questioned. I mean, you know, part of the far right is of course also very much aligned with this kind of far right theories that are pro-Russian. I would say the biggest change that you really see is that, you know, the Netherlands in a sense was a Western-oriented country, strongly committed to, you know, American leadership and so on, but also a pacifist country at the very same time, if that makes sense, that they thought that, you know, in the context of European integration and being surrounded by friends and allies and so on, we don't really need you know, military. Why should we, right? And that has really changed. Now there's a strong sense that the Netherlands could be under threat, and that you really need to invest. So I suppose it's the Zeiten when the discussion is, in that sense, I see it as very similar to Germany.
You know, that's contrary to what happens in Hungary. It's contrary to what happens in Slovakia. So that's an interesting discussion, which leads me to my next question. You said it's anti-elitist, so the society has changed, not Wilders necessarily has changed. Orban, for example, cannot be anti-elitist because Fidesz is the Hungarian elite in a way. So he's anti-elitist when it comes to EU. Yeah. What about Wilders?
I mean, he's both, right? I mean, he hasn't really taken on a government function as he wasn't really allowed to, right? So that is, in a sense, he can maintain it. And I think this is what you see precisely in Austria right now, if I understand it correctly, that the fact that they tried to leave them out of a government, despite the fact that they finished first, meant that there was a massive increase in support for them, right? So it would have been, you know, there was this sense that they should probably call on new elections, but well, the numbers showed that if you did that, PVV would have returned with way more than 23.5% at that moment.
That's a difficult question because were they left out of government, or did they have the chance to invite others to discuss with them? That's intricate. But anyway,
yes.
So
that's right. Yeah.
Okay, so let me introduce you, which we haven't done so far. The question on my side, where's my slip? Here, Martin Milan Šimečka. What's your first name that you use, Martin or Milan? Because Milan was your father's name too.
Yeah, that's a problem. This is my civic name, but Martin is because my father asked me when I started to write to give it another name, not to be Milan all the time, Milan Jr. when I'm 67 now. Would be stupid.
So he was
Martin, right. Yeah.
It's not Milan Jr., although his father was a famous dissident. You were a famous dissident too, so you stepped into his shoes in a way. You were not allowed to study because your father was a famous dissident, and started to, worked in all different kinds of jobs, quite hard upbringing in a way, and started in journalism in 1981, worked for dozens of famous newspapers and media in Slovakia, and have been writing, and you have developed to be a very famous novel author, right, as well. So, author of novels, of articles, chief editor of Slovakia Media, and in '89 you were part of the dissident movement in order to topple the government, and you were Slovakian president of the PEN for a while. So who do you work for now?
I work for Slovak Daily N, which is a fascinating story of a daily which is very successful. When Michal Horecki, who is a very good friend of mine, was talking about the media landscape which is trying to be conquered by the government, well, actually, I think it didn't succeed. Mm-hmm. And one of the signs is that Daily N, which I am now part of, is independent. It's just pure websites based on subscriptions. And in a small market like Slovakia, 5 million people, we have 70,000 subscribers. So we are really a rich paper, which we conquer even the Czech market and small Hungarian, whatever. It's a success story, which I say, that's another thing that the question is whether it is possible in a country like, and all is true what Michal and you have said about Slovakia, all the horror things are true. Still the question is whether it is possible if you still have in the country media which are free, independent, and you cannot actually, you have to ban them. You cannot manipulate them. Because this daily N, like I am, for example, is just based on subscribers, and the owners are the journalists themselves. So you cannot have any kind of impact to that. So that's another question. I still think the media landscape in Slovakia is far not as bad as as the government wanted to be. Even public TV, it's just well, it's very boring. But and they changed the director and whatever. But you cannot say it's pro-governmental. It's boring mostly. They just don't. They are not able to do anything. But you have this very strong commercial TV Markiza with a very strong news program, which they and the journalists fought for the independence, and they until now succeeded. So it's difficult, I would say, to create an authoritarian regime if you still have independent media, quite a strong ones. So that's a question which is for you Austrians. You should ask them yourself how strong the media landscape is, and if you are able to resist. I would say Fico is, until now, all what has been said is true, but I would say he's losing. That's my good news.
Let me pour some water into the wine and ask you, before we start to the big comparisons and the meta questions. That was true in Hungary in 2010, 11, 12, 13 as well. And then the oligarchs came and started buying media. And we had Nipzava, we had Nipzavatat, we had Origo, we had all the big media, and everybody, there were great journalists writing against Orban. And then, that slow taking over, it takes some time. You've only got 1 year so far. So I know you're optimistic, but I'd be a bit cautious.
I know the history of Hungarian media quite well, but I think there is a different history. I mean, we had been in Slovakia. The generation of journalists today, they are came from 90s, where the Mečiar was this authoritarian first example of authoritarian regime or populism, and these journalists, had been learned how to resist, which was not Hungarian case. That's a long story, but I think Hungarian journalists failed. Although they had a chance, but they failed because they were not prepared for the situation. Slovak journalists had been prepared. This generation is strong enough. I don't say that it can be, of course, it can go in the wrong way, but I'm rather optimistic about that. That's one of the reasons why I'm rather optimistic about the future of Slovakia. If we don't count the zeitgeist, which is bad all over, if it is only about Slovakia, I would be optimistic. Then, I would like to say something about which are, for Austrians might be lessons. What has been in the cultures, what has been said, it's quite important to know that the Minister of Culture and Minister of Environment are from the junior party, from the Slovak National Party, the lunatics, the fascists. And Mr. Fico pointed them to these ministers, thinking, okay, they're just nothing. And the biggest damage is actually in justice, environment, and culture, and foreign policy, but that's another case. And because of these people, because Minister of Education, for example, is from the other smaller party of the coalition, this Hlas from Pellegrini, and the Minister of Education is just fine.
So what you're saying is that
the guy is decent.
Did he make a mistake by appointing lunatics, or did he do the opposition a favor by appointing lunatics?
I think at first he didn't. Anyway. I think he didn't know what was going on. But then when they started really to not only to kill the culture but also to kill the environment, but they are starting to shoot bears and wolves and whatever, and they're logging the forest. It's just crazy. They kill the nature. They are killing the nature. But Fico actually likes it. And he supports that, saying the Minister of Culture is my favorite, because it's in favor for his voters who are happy about that. The problem is, in the beginning, if the FVP allows to FP to take Minister of Culture, I would say that would be a big mistake. I mean, so that's just about the lesson. The other thing is, I don't know about Austria how it will be, but the thing in Slovakia is that we have a lesson from the 90s where also Mečas tried to. There was another thing. He also went against the artists, independent, whatever, liberal, trying to change them into nationalists, another garniture, another class. And they still were from the communism, these socialist writers, and who transformed them into nationalists, whatever. And that attempt failed. What is happening today is not that the Minister of Culture, they don't want to change the culture to something else with the other ideology. They want to kill it. They want to destruct it and destroy. That's the aim. That's why, I mean, all people who change the positions, I mean, the new director of gallery or whatever the answers are not people from culture. They are some kind of economics, whatever.
That does make a point,
from nowhere. And so their idea is not to change the culture to the new ideology, but to kill it. Because I think this is not a case of Hungary.
Exactly. I was just
and that's
not
might be not the case in Austria if you have in Austria enough elites from this conservative populist side. In Slovakia, they are not.
Okay.
They are not. You have no one. So that it means the problem of culture, and it also brought the question which you might be confronted with. It's a moral question. For the people those who were fired, it's okay. But there were a lot of people who stayed in various funds, cultural funds, which still maybe are working, but only formally, whether to stay and to legitimize the politics of the culture or to go. And the big debate was last year in culture whether to stay or to go. I'm one who say you have to go, you have to leave because you legitimize that. I mean, the result will be they will be fired, all of them. But until now, some of them who stay actually make a mistake because I think you should just go. You shouldn't legitimize because it was obvious what would be the development of that. Yeah. So that's a question for Austrians, how to behave in that situation when it starts.
Yes. It will start. I don't want to stress too many, comparisons because obviously there are differences and we have to talk about them too, which is why I want to ask, in Fico's case, he had to build that coalition with two extremist parties, and as what you say is he's not an ideologist, he's probably just corrupt and he wants to maybe save his skin. I don't. Let me leave it at that for a second. Yeah. Orban won his first 2/3 majority with his first election, if I remember rightly. So he had the power to change everything at a whim when he wanted to, and he did. And he had an ideological idea outlined for him, right?
In many ways, yes. He definitely had a kind of plan of the steps or the stages of how to concentrate power. I should also say that I think culture was not one of his priorities early on. I think that came probably after something like 8 or 9 years. Then that suddenly they said, okay, we also want to be the leading force, break the cultural hegemony of our opponents or what have you. And then they started investing really massively. That's, by the way, also one of the major differences I see between the Netherlands and Hungary right now in this respect. Because, when you look at the Hungarian regime...
Where did they invest? I'm sorry.
They invested in their own elite training. They invested in journals. They invested in
their own universities.
Books distribution.
Books institute. So there is a kind of attempt, which is very interesting, I think, to think about historically. Why is it that this regime, which is very anti-intellectual, also thinks that you need to impress the intellectual elites internationally, right? That's, I think, something very peculiar to the socialization also of the leader of the country, and probably certain people around him, that they have this ambition. In the Netherlands, this hasn't at all started. If anything, they are withdrawing money from what they think is not useful enough and is for other people and so on. So that is definitely very different. And again, but for Orban, the attack on universities and so this really came not in his first 2 terms.
No,
basically.
the universities being changed into
After,
foundations, bought up and rededicated to their own people, his own people that came in 1819 or something, maybe even 20s. I don't remember. Anyways, but. Martin said they made a mistake, they should have gone. In Hungary, most of the elite stayed. Why? They're playing Orban's game, almost all of them.
This is difficult for me to agree with, even though we might, of course, legitimately disagree on what so to say the facts are as we see them. I happen to be in the Netherlands. I think there's just a whole host of Hungarians who are permanently on the look out for possibilities to leave. I experience that very regularly. People contact me whether I can help them with getting somewhere, and even people I don't really know, right? And maybe that's just, again, my particular perspective. But yes, that is really true, that of course in Hungary there's a very strong sense that this country is going to be good enough, right? That there wouldn't be a need to emigrate, and living in Budapest in particular is probably a fair deal compared to many other places in Europe, and so on and so forth. So of course the emigration of Hungarians started in a sense later than the emigration of many other people from Eastern European countries, but then it became a really massive wave in the 2010s. And I think especially if you look at it generationally, I happen to be in my early 40s now. I went to a high school class we had 39 people, so there were 38 others, but the large majority of these people have left one way or another, and they went all around the world. I have, classmates in Australia and in Canada and what have you. So,
okay. One of the first things that Orban changed was the electoral system, step by step. 2010-11 were the first steps, and he adjusted the whole electoral system to his own needs. Is that something that Fico will do?
I don't think so. It's not so easy. You need a constitutional majority for that.
Exactly.
And not only that, the other lesson for Austrians could be, because the question was similar after the elections. I have to say that my son is the leader of the oppositional party, the Progressive Slowakei, which is the leader actually in the polls. So I am a little bit biased.
The party that we just talked about, which won the European elections.
Actually, they were second in the elections, but they still had a chance to create a government from this Pellegrini party from Hlas. Then they have chosen to go with Fico, this Pellegrini's party. Yeah. Exactly the Austrian case. You could have a democratic government without populist, but they failed. In this case, it was this Pellegrini's party, the Hlas, which opted voluntarily, although they had a chance to go with Fico and to be part of the real populistic, partly fascistic or neo-fascist government.
What were their arguments, the official ones?
They say that the voters are more pro this solution. They were, wow, and Pellegrini is a guy who is easily blackmailed, so Fico, he was scared of whatever. They had a talk with my son about that, and it took 2 weeks. Seemed actually almost to be possible situation, and then he decided otherwise. So, but what happened is this party is in the government. It might be a fate of FVP. It's completely under the pressure of the fascist majority. Completely. And the first half years, first 10 months, they were obedient. They voted for the terrible, terrible laws about justice, whatever, even this culture, as wanted to be loyal. And now they are in a big trouble, the party itself. They are already, and that's why I'm optimistic, because that might happen in FVP, I don't know. But they are already, the government has 79 mandates in the four votes, 4 mandates majority. In this party already, in this junior party, there are 4 members who started 3 months ago to revolt, saying we don't vote anymore for these.
So you were saying the government
declining
is doomed?
democracy. So it's obviously you have already, Fico has not a majority. In fact, for the crucial laws like electoral votes or other things like even the foreign policy, whatever, could be threatened by these revolting members, because they are fed up with this stupidity and fascism.
Okay.
So there are still, you find a people who have some kind of moral, whatever,
Code, whatever.
we can say it, but he has to be brutal. So it was so brutal that 4 of these MPs said, well, enough is enough. So I get sure the government is quite fragile.
Okay.
And it might be early elections this year, maybe next year. Another problem for it are voters. The problem of that is, which I'm shocked still, the governmental parties still have the same number of voters like in the elections. So the electorate, the voters who voted for the government, are satisfied.
Mm-hmm.
They are happy with that. And Fico is trying to mobilize them all the time, naming all the enemies or whatever, and mobilize his own electorate by all these Facebook, whatever, social media. He doesn't talk to media anymore, he just speaks only through social media. And that's a question, because you said that the electorate has changed in Netherlands. And the question is how in Austria people will react. In Slovakia, until now, if the elections are today in Slovakia, the result will probably more or less the same.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
And that's the trouble.
That's the trouble. Let me ask you, there is a new contender of Orban. First time since 14 years there's someone who might win an election in 26. I'm not quite sure, but anyways, Peter Magyar. Do you think he has a chance? Looking at the way, as I said, that the electoral system has changed, and is Orban's government fragile? I mean, we want to stay optimistic tonight. We don't want to go out to home and cry.
Yes, we have more than a year until the next election, unless they call for new elections ahead of that. There's a debate about that at the moment. Certainly in the polls, it looks like Magyar's Tisza party is ahead at the moment, which is, of course, really amazing if you consider that his first interview was given less than a year ago. Right, so that is of course something that you can only, I guess, have in the 21st century, right? That basically a movement almost seemingly out of nothing can challenge something like a kind of quasi-party state in such a short period of time. But it's extremely unclear to me whether to what extent you have something like an open contestation. I can personally imagine that Fidesz would lose an election. The problem is what would follow, right? You might have a government against them, but of course the system, I think, is blocked to such an extent that with a simple majority you can't really reverse very much. So I think, in a sense, I would say whether Orban would continue to govern in a formal sense, that's doubtful. Whether he would maintain his power, that I think is much, much more certain.